In this tutorial, I'll teach you the basics of working with watercolor brushes in your digital art application. Because the sophistication of watercolor simulation varies from one application to another, I will just focus on what is universal. You'll need to dive into the complexities of your specific application to learn the more advanced stuff. The first place to start when emulating the look for traditional watercolor is to prepare your canvas. I have this drawing of a crow with a couple of layers for the ink and watercolor. It's beneficial to keep the ink separate so the watercolor paint doesn't mess it up. Next, you'll need a paper texture that looks like a watercolor paper. In an application like Rebel, you simply select a watercolor paper and it will cover the paint with texture to make the pigment look like it's absorbing into the paper. Before we get too far ahead, on the bottom is a toned background that turns the canvas an off-white so you can better see the paper texture. The white light projected from your computer display is far brighter than the whitest traditional paper. In art applications that don't have an interactive paper texture, you'll need to either load a background image of paper to paint on top of, or load a grayscale texture on a layer set to an overlay blend mode, and place it above everything in the composition. If the paper texture is too strong for you, you can easily reduce it. In Rebel, I'll do that from the visual settings. If I'm using a background layer or an overlay, then I can simply reduce the opacity of that layer. Next, I'll select the watercolor layer and choose a watercolor brush, then paint a stroke. You can see how much the paper texture enhances the look of the paint. If possible, you might also try adding the same or similar paper texture to the brush to see if it helps the paint look like it's interacting with the paper. The ink is on a separate layer set to multiply so that we can color beneath it on the blank watercolor layer. This can help the watercolor to look more natural. This combination of layers gives you the look of watercolor. Without these layers, it will be difficult to faithfully emulate a traditional watercolor painting. Once you've set it all up, you can save a canvas like this without any paint on it and use it as a template. I have a set of real art templates you can add to just about any art application. These have the paper texture layers already created for you. You can find that on my website at aaronrutten.com. While some artists may prefer the aesthetic of trying to emulate traditional watercolor, you do not have to use watercolors in this way. However, if you are going to attempt to make something that looks like a traditional watercolor, you'll need to study what a traditional watercolor painting looks like, as well as the tools, techniques, and processes used. Traditional watercolor paintings are made by diluting pigment in water. When working with digital watercolors, the opacity of the paint is often what controls the concentration of the pigment. The less opaque the color, the less concentrated the pigment will appear. Paint that is less concentrated takes many more layers of paint to build up to full opacity and saturation. If the color builds up too quickly, it may ruin the illusion of traditional watercolor. To learn some techniques for quickly changing your brush opacity, check out my reference video about opacity. I'll fill in the crow with a light blue. It's okay to be sloppy since this is a demonstration, but if this were a more important painting, I'd be more careful about keeping my paint inside the lines. You might even consider using a selection to keep the paint inside the lines. Next, I'll select a light brown color and fill in the branch. It can be helpful to break up your painting into several layers. So long as these layers are set to multiply, they will blend together naturally where they overlap. You might even experiment with the color burn blending mode if you want a bit of hue shift as the pigment thins out. One advantage to this is that you need not worry about messing up elements of the painting you're already satisfied with. You can also more easily edit specific colors or areas of your painting by isolating them. For example, I can blend or erase just this one piece rather than everything surrounding it. If I want to change the color of this paint, I can do that with an HSV filter rather than repainting it. Blending watercolors together is something that will greatly enhance the effectiveness of your digital watercolor paintings. I recommend sticking to a blender that has a wet look to it. Oftentimes, there is a wet blender you can choose. If not, then just be sure to use a blender with a soft edge that can blend to transparency. As you can see, I can give the illusion that I am wetting this watercolor paint and thinning it out to blend it into the paper. I can also mix two colors together to make a seamless gradient. Because you don't typically use an eraser on traditional watercolor, you will want to reserve any areas you want to remain white in your painting. You can use your eraser to remove digital watercolor paint, but that does not look very natural. Even an eraser that is made to look wet looks odd, so it's best just to avoid white areas or protect them with a selection. Because watercolor is transparent and the layer blending mode is usually set to multiply, you can paint with white and it will function as plain water. This will thin out the opacity of the paint and soften the edges when you use light pressure. Heavy pressure will lift the paint from the canvas like an eraser. This works because when multiply is selected, any white on that layer becomes fully transparent. The last thing I want to mention about working with watercolor is performance. If you're using one of the advanced watercolor applications like Rebelle, it can be very demanding on your computer. If you add all of the possible properties to your watercolor brush and paint over a large area of your canvas, the diffusion process is going to take a very long time to complete. If you try to do anything else on your canvas, you might find that performance grinds to a halt, or the application might even crash. As with its traditional counterpart, it's best to be patient with digital watercolor and paint a little at a time rather than too much at once. If possible, you can pause your diffusion. This will stop the watercolor from flowing, which will allow you to lay down paint without as much lag. Unpausing the diffusion will resume the flow. Another way to improve performance is to work on a smaller canvas when dealing with watercolor. That covers the basics of working with watercolor brushes in a digital art application. There is a lot more to cover in terms of advanced properties like making the watercolor drip and flow. For that, I would recommend taking my Rebelle or Corel Painter training courses. You can find those on my website at aaronrutten.com.